This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about dealing with insecurity. So, let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 35 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin, thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about insecurity. I'll be discussing the common causes of insecurity and ways that you can beat it in order to build greater confidence. So let's talk. Everyone has something they're insecure about. Everyone. I will guarantee you that even those super confident people who might be bordering on narcissism are never 100% secure about every aspect of themselves. In healthy doses, insecurity can serve as a note of caution before we jump headfirst into things. But when our insecurities begin to take over our lives and prevent us from moving forward and growing, that's when they can begin to do damage. In the words of Norman Vincent Peale, without a humble but reasonable confidence in your own powers, you cannot be successful or happy. So what is insecurity? Insecurity is defined as uncertainty or anxiety about oneself or lack of confidence. Thanks, Apple Dictionary. Interestingly, the word actually has two definitions in English. The other is the state of being open to danger or threat or lack of protection. And we hear that being used in a lot of conversations, especially at the moment, about a range of topics from job insecurity, especially now with so much of the world being plunged into recession recently, through to the physical and psychological impacts of threats from warfare and disease. Insecurity is similar to nervousness, worry, vulnerability, peril, danger. So, if it's taken to extremes, insecurity can represent a really serious threat to your mental health and well-being. Insecurity and self-doubt can do a lot of damage if we let it control us or hold us back. And so that's why today I'm going to be talking about how we can tackle insecurity. First, what causes insecurity? There are many different causes, and some of the common ones are traumatic events, loss, crisis, so for example, relationship breakdowns, financial difficulties, failure, rejection, social anxiety, perfectionism, past criticisms, especially from loved ones, negative self-image, negative self-talk, which is something I discussed back in episode 9, and especially where that inner voice becomes overly critical. Another one is needing external approval, and that's where social media can become dangerous, but more on that later. Another example is imposter syndrome, which you've probably heard of. It's when you doubt your accomplishments and have a persistent fear of being exposed for being a fraud. That's another example of insecurity in action. If you've ever done any kind of study in or reading about psychology, then you'll possibly be aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a theory put forward by Abraham Maslow back in 1943, and it looks at how our needs shape our behaviours, starting at the most basic and fundamental needs, being food, warmth, safety and security, etc., through to our higher level needs of belonging and accomplishment, all the way up to our highest needs of fulfilling our potential. The theory suggests that if our more fundamental needs are threatened, then we can start to experience symptoms like anxiety. And I'll put a link to some information from Wikipedia in the transcript. I bring that up because, like any theory, it's not necessarily perfect, but it does go some way towards explaining how feelings of insecurity can be triggered when our security or our sense of belonging is threatened. For some of us, insecurity can be rooted in past traumas or difficult childhoods or being bullied. For others, specific situations or events can trigger feelings of insecurity. And for most who deal with insecurity, it might come and go, or it may become a more permanent companion. Now, just a quick note here about jealousy. I'm not specifically speaking about jealousy in today's episode because it's more of a symptom of feeling insecure rather than a specific root cause. The things I will talk about today will definitely be applicable to dealing with jealousy. However, I'm also going to be talking about relationships in episode 38, which is due for release in early August. And the topic of jealousy will be covered as part of a broader conversation about the good, the bad, and the ugly of personal relationships. So if that's something that you're dealing with, then you'll find this episode and that future one to be helpful. Going back to the subject of insecurity, at its core, insecurity is a protection mechanism that is deeply rooted in fear. And for most people, it's potentially something that developed a long time ago. Even though it might feel like it's holding us back from being the best version of ourselves that we can be, what it's actually trying to do is to protect you from those things that you're afraid of, whether you're consciously afraid of them or unconsciously. For example, I had a good friend who I was really close with, but we've been growing apart for a few years since my partner and I moved to the country, and now she doesn't even respond to my messages. The other week it was my birthday, and I know that she knows when it is because one of her nephews, who she's quite close to, has the same birthday. And when I didn't receive a message from her, I found myself checking social media repeatedly for days to see if anything had come through, which of course just made things worse. And it just triggered off all of these insecurities. And then finally, after about 3 days, I snapped out of it and I was able to take a step back so that I could analyze what I was doing more objectively. And in this case, I already know that friendship ran its course several years ago. And yet, because of insecurities, I still sometimes find myself clinging on to some faint hope that things will change. Why? Well, because it triggers my insecurities around rejection. I was rejected by my father as a child when he left my mother and he married into a new family. And I always found it tough at school, to make more than just a few friends as a kid because I was blessed with crippling social anxiety, as well as being seen as being different and weird because I'm creative. So the reason why I bring all that up is just like with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when our need for social belonging is threatened, we can become defensive and we can have real difficulties in coping with the insecurities that can be triggered. There's lots of different causes, that's an example of rejection, and being rejected sucks. And that topic of rejection is probably even worthy of its own episode at some point in the future because it is a big topic and I don't want to get too sidetracked today, so I might put a pin in that and come back to it later. All right, back to insecurity. Feelings of insecurity can trigger defense mechanisms, which are internal and external behaviors that can kick in as a means of protecting ourselves from hurt or pain. There's a fascinating recent article written by US psychologist Leon Seltzer about defense mechanisms and getting them under control. I'll put the link in the bio. I think it's fascinating anyway. It's only like a 5-minute read. And in it he writes, and I just want to quote this paragraph. I think it's a good segue into the next part of today's conversation. So here is the quote from Seltzer. Your defense mechanisms can be defined broadly, not just psychoanalytically, as repression, denial, displacement, projection, and the like, but also as excessive people-pleasing, an overgeneralized distrust of others, an almost reflexive avoidance of intimacy, procrastination, passive aggression, selective inattention or forgetting, or being afflicted with a super harsh or strident inner critic. Such defenses arose in the first place because at any particular moment, whether rationally or not, you experienced an extreme threat. And again, I'll put the link to that article in the transcript. Now, I shared that paragraph because I think it gives a good summary of some of the common types of insecurities and how they can manifest, but also because, whether we like to admit it or not, our deepest fears and insecurities have a habit of niggling away at us and bubbling back up to the surface whenever we feel threatened, unless we take the time to confront them, process them, and release them, which is a process that I call mental CPR, confront, process, release. And just like CPR, it can become a lifesaver when it comes to dealing with insecurity. I'll come back to that process shortly in the how-to part of this week's episode. It's worth noting as well that I have previously talked about a few topics that can trigger feelings of insecurity in some of my past episodes. I talked about fear in episode 10, baggage in episode 7, overthinking in episode 4, opinions in episode 21, and uncertainty in episode 25. So, depending on your individual circumstances, you might also find those to be helpful to explore some of those specific feelings. The link is in the transcript for those, or you can head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes, where you'll find links to all of the transcripts, the written versions of every episode, as well as links to listen on Spotify. Insecurity and self-confidence are inextricably linked with one another in that they either allow us to achieve our potential as human beings, or they crush us under the weight of fear. Every human being is worthy of being the best they can be, and confidence isn't about needing people to like you or to approve of you. Instead, it's about being okay if they don't. In the words of Marie Curie, life is not easy for any of us, but what of that? We must have perseverance and, above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something and that this thing, at whatever cost, must be attained. And so with that quote in mind, let's jump into the how-to part of this week's episode. First, let's talk about where you get your motivation from, because I can sit here and give you 1,000 different ways to tackle insecurity, but unless we confront this, it's probably going to be a waste of time. Here's a question. What motivates you more? What you think of yourself or what other people think of you? And be honest when you answer that. For most of us, it's a combination of both internal and external factors. But the difference between self-confidence and insecurity is whether or not you put more importance on what other people think than what you think. As I mentioned before, I talked about opinions back in episode 21 of Let's Talk About Mental Health. And in that episode, I made the point that opinions are just noise. You will never please everybody all of the time. And if you let the opinions of others control what you do or don't do, then you'll never try new things and you will never grow. In a nutshell, you're more likely to have greater confidence and self-esteem by building your intrinsic motivation. In other words, being motivated by your own internal drive for success or sense of purpose, rather than by what other people think. Probably the biggest challenge to your self-confidence can be relying on external validation, and that is where my comment earlier about social media comes in. And it's something that I really encourage you to think about strongly. I think it's so easy to get caught up in this world of looking at the likes or the number of followers, and I strongly encourage you to consider switching off more often, or at the very least, turning off notifications on likes, because those sort of things can drive us into this constant cycle of trying to please others through what we post, rather than focusing on our own internal life satisfaction and posting stuff that makes us feel happy. And look, life is just too short to give a shit what other people think. As long as you're not doing any harm to others or yourself, then you do you. And so then that leads into tackling your insecurities, and a word of warning here, overcoming your insecurities can be terrifying, which can of course heighten the insecurities further. But sometimes you have to go through it in order to get through it. And if that means that things might get a bit worse before they get better, then that's okay, because it's an investment in your future happiness. So please, once you start this work, keep going even when the going gets tough, because it will eventually get much, much better. So there are 5 main steps in terms of working through insecurity. They are confront, process, release, substitute, and daily effort. Now those first 3 steps, confront, process, release, or CPR, are closely aligned to previous discussions that I've had about letting go. And that's something I explored in a fair bit of detail back in episode 32, Letting Go. So I'm going to do a brief overview here, and again, if you'd like to explore that further, head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes and either listen to or read that episode. I make a point here of linking back episodes that are relevant to the conversation that I'm talking about, so that especially for those of you who listen every single week, that you're not hearing me say the same things over and over again. Okay, so going through those 5 steps, let's start with confront. I'm a very firm believer in the benefit of dealing with things as they are, rather than just ignoring them or sticking our head in the sand and pretending that things are fine when they're clearly not. If you're bothered by something, that's a sign from yourself that there is some work to be done, even if that work just involves acknowledging the existence of that insecure feeling. Trying to hide from your feelings is just resisting the inevitable, and if you've ever watched Star Trek, then you'll know that resistance is futile. Although I'm not quite sure that quoting the Borg to inspire and motivate people about insecurity is what was intended with that line when it was written, but who cares, I'm running with it. You can run, but you cannot hide, and so it's important to confront the truth. Now, if you're prone to negative self-talk, you owe it to yourself to confront it and do something about it. To paraphrase the words of Louise Hay, if you have been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked, try approving of yourself and see what happens. Just let that thought sink in for a minute. As I mentioned before, self-talk is something I explored in episode 9, so if that is something that you're prone to, negative self-talk, jump over and check that one out. Let's move on to the second step, which is process. In other words, process what you're feeling and understand why your insecurities have been triggered. Now, that could be something that you do on your own, or it could be done by working with a counselor or psychologist, or it could be a combination of both. I have mentioned many, many times before why it's so important to get help when you need it, especially for serious trauma, as well as why you also need to do the work. Because someone external can help you to process things objectively and rationally, which is really important. However, at the same time, they can't get into your head and make all the dots connect for you. So I think that the best approach to dealing with things, especially anything more deep-seated, is to have a combination of working on it yourself, as well as working on it with a professional. In another linkage to a previous episode, yet again, I would suggest that you check out episode 7, Baggage, for a more in-depth guide to the process of processing. But in short, the key message in this stage is that you need to get underneath what you're feeling and, more importantly, why you're feeling it. Don't just deal with the symptoms. Dig deep and get into the gooey center of what's going on underneath the surface. Your feelings are like an iceberg. You might have heard this analogy before. What you see with an iceberg above the water is usually only about 10% of the mass of the iceberg. Roughly 90% of it exists underneath the surface, just like your feelings. What the world gets to see of you is just that little small 10% bit above the surface, which is your behaviors. But the way you behave is driven by what's going on underneath the surface. Your thoughts and feelings, which are just below the surface, and then much more deeply, your needs and whether or not they are being met. If you remember back to what I was saying earlier about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if any of your needs are being threatened, especially those more fundamental ones like security and belonging, then that could be triggering feelings of insecurity. Work through the feelings to understand why they're happening, which will then allow you to better address the root cause. So once you've processed your feelings and you're clear on the root cause, the next step is release. In order to overcome the insecure feelings, you need to let go of them. Now, letting go can be tough, and I talked about this back in episode 32 with letting go, and I'm going to do something that feels a little weird, but I'm actually going to quote myself here. I'm going to revisit a paragraph that I talked about in episode 32, so here goes. Letting go is more about you than anyone else. It's a choice that you make to take back your power by understanding the impact of whatever has happened, accepting it, learning from it, and making changes where you need to, and then letting it go, so that whatever it was no longer holds any power over you. The thing about this releasing stage is you owe it to yourself to release the past. It is done, and it cannot be changed. And if you let it control you here and now, then all it will do is take away from your happiness today. Let it go. If this is something that you find challenging, go back and check out episode 32 for a much more in-depth discussion around letting go. But also, a lot of this stuff about processing and releasing things sits really closely under the topic of acceptance, which is actually going to be the subject of next week's episode, so look out for that one as well. Okay, once you've worked through releasing, it's time for step 4, substitute. This is about choosing to be aware of when insecurity is niggling at you, and instead of giving in to it, replacing it with acceptance and positive thoughts. In this context, acceptance means accepting that the thought is happening and just observing it mindfully, instead of giving in to it or trying to fight it. What this does is that over time, it trains you to start detaching yourself from the emotions that are attached to that feeling, so that then you can approach it much more rationally and objectively. And part of that also involves replacing those negative thoughts with more positive ones. For example, if your insecurity kicks in around something that you feel negatively about, stop yourself and notice that the thought is happening. Then remind yourself of your positives instead. Again, if you're dealing with negative self-talk, check out episode 9 for a more in-depth guide there. The 5th and final step is daily effort. Now, I say final, but I think it's probably pretty clear by now that there's never really a final step with this type of work. When it comes to improving your mental health and well-being, it takes work every single day. There is no magical cure, and you very well might be working on this stuff for the rest of your life, which is totally okay. Accepting ourselves takes time and takes patience. And yes, there might be setbacks along the way, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you keep on letting go and moving forward. There are lots of things that you can do every day to defeat your insecurities and build greater self-confidence, such as gratitude practice, mindfulness, meditation, and daily affirmations. So an example of a daily affirmation could be repeating to yourself in the mirror or wherever feels comfortable for you, some kind of statement that feels right to you, such as, I release my past insecurities, doubts, and fears, and instead I focus on feeling confident and secure. I am unique, I am strong, and I am worthy. So you can use that or whatever works best for you. Now, part of that process might also involve getting regular support. So, for example, by going to see a counsellor or a therapist every week or every second week in order to work through things in more detail and explore different coping mechanisms that work for you. The most important thing is to keep moving forward every day. It doesn't matter how small the steps are, but some sort of action, some sort of focus every single day is better than nothing. And when it comes to insecurity, what it all boils down to is this. Your fears and doubts might be trying to protect you, but if you let them control you, then they are doing much more harm than good. I believe with all my heart that the majority of us are good people at our core, and if you do no harm to others or yourself, and you choose to put kindness out into the world, and you give more than you take, then those other things that you might feel insecure about just aren't important, so let them go. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemy. So instead of fighting our insecurities, we can choose instead to look them straight in the eye. And by doing so, you strip them of their power. And when you do that, nothing can ever stop you. That's nearly it for this week. Each week I like to share a quote about the week's topic and encourage you to take a few moments to reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it is, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Let me repeat that. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Alright, that's it for this week. Next week, I'll be talking about acceptance. I'll be discussing the role of acceptance in good mental health, as well as how to get better at accepting yourself for who you are. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK and Ireland, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health. That's at LTA Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice and tell someone that you know about the show, because word of mouth really helps new people to discover the program. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.